Harriet Bell had lived in Poppywood her entire life, and though it was a humble town, something about its charm kept her planted. She owned Cozy Corner Thrift, a shop nestled between an old candy store and the post office, where locals found hidden gems among crocheted blankets, vintage jewelry, and decades-old dresses. Each item carried a story, and Harriet relished discovering those histories from the customers who wandered in with barely used tea sets or antique lamps, all seeking new homes. One late afternoon, when the springtime sunlight slanted through the wide glass windows of Cozy Corner Thrift, an unfamiliar truck rumbled to a stop out front. Harriet halted her dusting of a tall bookshelf full of vinyl records and peered through the window. Deliveries weren't especially frequent, she advertised a pickup service, but it was rare for someone to require that kind of help. Unless it was for a particularly large donation. A wiry man stepped out, gave a polite wave through the window, and then hoisted down a large trunk from the truck bed. Harriet went out to meet him. "You Harriet Bell?" he asked, adjusting his baseball cap. "That's me," Harriet replied, offering a friendly smile. "I didn't know we had a scheduled pickup. Said you accept large donations?" He gestured at the trunk resting on the curb. "I'm Eli from Pineview Estate Cleanouts. Got a trunk from a storage unit that's being cleared. It's prepaid for donation, so I'm dropping it off where they told me." Harriet glanced at the trunk. It was battered, edges frayed, the brass latch beginning to turn green. Decades of dust streaked the leather sides. "Well, I never turn away a donation. Let's bring it in." With a grunt, the two carried the trunk inside and set it near the counter. As soon as Harriet thanked Ellie, he hopped back into his truck and rumbled off, leaving Harriet alone with the hush of her shop and the weathered trunk's presence. She felt that familiar quiver of excitement. It was heavier than your everyday scrap of furniture, and that gave her pause. Maybe it contained old clothes or books, pieces from someone's life. This was exactly the kind of item Harriet lost herself in, reading the edges of its story through the things inside. She took a moment to close the blinds and flip the store sign from open to closed. The evening sun had almost disappeared behind the rooftops. A single lamp near the counter cast a warm circle of light over the trunk. Harriet knelt, adjusted the tarnished latch, and gave it a hesitant tug. It stuck momentarily, then let go with a rusty squeak. A faint smell of old paper and cedar wafted out. Inside were rows of carefully stacked diaries. She counted 6, each bound in brown or black leather, every cover embossed with a year scrawled in gold. Each diary was labeled from 1951 to 1956. There was also a faded newspaper clipping tucked between 2 of the volumes, and several loose photographs depicting a grand ivy-covered mansion. Some photos showed a regal family gathered on the porch, the father in a sharp suit, the mother in pearls, and a pair of children wearing polite smiles. In others, the lawn spread out in a massive green ocean, capturing summer gatherings that looked full of laughter and promise. On the backside of some photos, Harriet saw a delicate handwritten notation, "Cartwright Summer Home." Harriet heard tales of the old Cartwright mansion from time to time. Though the memory had mostly faded among younger residents, the older townspeople still whispered about a tragic fire that destroyed the property decades ago. It was left in ruins at the edge of Poppywood's forest for many years, until further storms and salvaging operations crumbled most of it. There had been no official conclusion about what caused the fire, and as Harriet recalled, it had become a bit of a local legend. Curiosity flared in her chest. She gently lifted one of the diaries, the leather stiff with age. On the inner cover, Lydia Cartwright was embossed in delicate gold script. There was no second-guessing it. These diaries belonged to the daughter in those photographs, probably the teenage girl standing beside her parents on the porch. Harriet felt a momentary surge of guilt for reading the personal diaries of someone long gone, but the diaries had come into her possession for a reason. Maybe they would find a new home here in Poppywood. She carefully flipped open the 1951 diary. The pages were thinning at the edges, faintly yellowed. She read, January 10, 1951. Never have I felt so lonely in this big house. Father is busy with business, Mother with her endless parties. At dinner they spoke of expansions to the Cartwright Empire. I sat silent, hoping someone would ask me about my day. It was a typical teenage lament, but Harriet felt a pang of sympathy. She read on, skipping to later pages. March 22, 1951. The west parlor is full of boxes again. Servants whisper about the upcoming renovation. Father is determined to modernize the mansion, but I love it as is. I swear I smell something like kerosene in the back hallways. It unsettles me, but nobody else seems to notice. This mention of kerosene made Harriet's heart jump. Over the years, some in Poppywood had whispered that the Cartwright fire was no accident. Could Lydia have recorded clues that would point to something more sinister? Harriet closed the diary gently, placing it back on top of the trunk. She glanced at the others. She'd have to read them carefully, searching for critical details. The next morning, Harriet woke early, eager to return to the diaries. She opened Cozy Corner Thrift a bit later than usual, so she'd have time to settle with a cup of tea. She arranged the diaries on her work table in chronological order. As soon as she unlocked the shop door for customers, Harriet stood behind the counter and began reading from where she'd left off. The diaries were mesmerizing. She was transported to the grandeur of daily life in what had once been the largest estate in Poppywood. Lydia wrote about lavish soirees, tension between her parents, and her own yearning for normalcy. She described hearing arguments late at night about finances and expansions, about how her father was worried that the Cartwright name would lose significance if they didn't keep up with modern amenities. All this gave Harriet a sense that the family veneer of wealth concealed cracks. But it was the recurring mention of kerosene smells and Lydia's uneasy hunches that most intrigued Harriet. One entry from October 1951 stood out. October 2, 1951. I found Father shouting at Charles, our groundskeeper, about whether everything was locked up. Father seemed furious that Charles missed something in the barn. Later, I caught a faint whiff of that same chemical odor. Charles just walked away looking frightened. Why? This tension between father and employee had Harriet's thoughts spinning. Harriet knew from scattered rumors that the Cartwright patriarch had died in the fire, and Charles had disappeared from town soon after. Some rumored that he was the cause. Others believed he died in the blaze, though no one knew for sure. Customers trickled in and out that day, browsing for second-hand books or rummaging through racks of linen tablecloths. Harriet politely interacted with them, all the while counting down to the moment she could return to Lydia's diaries. In the early afternoon, the local librarian Gloria Hughes stepped in to bring Harriet a donation of gently used romance novels. Harriet spared no time in telling her close friend about the diaries. Lydia Cartwright's diaries, you say? Gloria's voice was hushed, eyes glittering with interest. The old Cartwright mansion that burned down in '56. Everyone in town used to talk about it. My grandmother used to say it was the biggest tragedy this town had seen. Harriet nodded, leaning on the counter. How much do you know about it? Well, Gloria said, just rumors. Everyone agreed it was suspicious, but the fire marshal never pinned down the cause. My grandmother said some neighbors saw a strange glow from the windows a day or two before the blaze. Others mentioned hearing arguments. A lot of folks suspected arson. I don't want to pry, but part of me thinks these diaries might have some valuable insight. Maybe it could finally put the rumor mill to rest. Harriet cast a glance at the trunk behind the counter. Would it be strange to read them all? Gloria patted Harriet's hand. If you want to do Lydia justice, read away. You might find something that helps people understand the truth. That settled it. That evening, Harriet locked up, hurried home to her cozy cottage on Maple Street, and curled up in her reading nook with the diaries. Outside, a storm rattled the windows, but Harriet felt safe and warm, pressing forward into Lydia's world. She was determined to unravel the mystery. She made swift progress through 1952 and 1953, which, aside from glimpses of a growing rift between Mr. Cartridge and Charles, the groundskeeper, contained mostly teenage musings about Lydia's dance lessons, her high society parties, and a boy from the local private school who had caught her fancy. Occasionally, Lydia wrote of new expansions, contractors with unfamiliar faces trudging in and out of the mansion, rumours of cost overruns, and an unmistakable tension saturating the household. Then, the 1954 volume began differently. February 14, 1954. Mother is furious with father again over money. I heard whispers that something was missing from the accounts. Father always scolds me if I enter his study without knocking. He's changed the locks on everything. Charles is rarely around now. The new caretaker, Mr. Dolan, is cold-hearted. He smells like kerosene, too. Maybe it's an oil for the lawn mowers, but it reminds me of Charles. Something about it unsettles me. Harriet paused. Another caretaker, this Mr. Dolan, who also smelled of kerosene. That was more coincidence than Harriet cared to believe. Could it be an oil for the estate's machinery, or something else altogether? She read on, riveted. August 21, 1954. We had a small fire scare today in the east wing. The curtains near the fireplace caught a spark. Thankfully the servants put it out quickly. Mother fainted and father was livid. Mr. Durham insisted it was an accident, but I'm puzzled. Nothing about that day felt normal. Have we invited some curse to this house? Harriet closed the diary, her heart beating quickly. The diaries weren't proven evidence, but they certainly pointed to an undercurrent of tension and potential sabotage. Harriet decided she needed more community insight. She wanted to talk to Edna Martin, a long-time Poppywood resident in her 80s who had once been a seamstress for the Cartwright family. If anyone could shed light, Edna could. After calling Edna and requesting a short visit, Harriet drove to the small retirement community on the outskirts of Poppywood. The caretaker let her in, and she found Edna in the communal library, flipping through a scrapbook. "Harriet, dear," Edna greeted, adjusting her reading glasses. "It's been a long time since you paid me a visit." Harriet settled into a chair beside her, diaries clutched in her bag. "Miss Martin, I have some diaries from Lydia Cartwright. They detail some suspicious activity at the mansion leading up to the big fire. Do you remember Charles or Mr. Dolan?" Edna exhaled a slow breath. "I recall Charles well. He was the Cartwrights' long-time groundskeeper, a gentle soul, always whistling. But he left in 53 rather suddenly. Rumour was Mr. Cartwright accused him of stealing some expensive tools or maybe something bigger. Dolan was hired short after. He was a brash man. I remember he gave me a scare once, sneaking up on me while I was mending some sheets on the 3rd floor. He smelled of gasoline or kerosene, some flammable brew for the estate's machinery. So, he claimed. Edna's voice grew quiet. Some folks believed Dolan was meddling in that house, maybe fueling the tension. Others thought Mr. Cartwright set the fire himself for the insurance money. But it went out of control. I don't know what to believe. All I know is Lydia was a sweet girl, and it broke my heart that her diaries were never found. She died in that fire, you know." Harriet felt tears prick her eyes. "I didn't realize she perished. I assumed maybe she left Poppywood." Edna nodded sadly. "She was in the West Wing that night. It collapsed first. They never recovered a body, only charred remains they assumed were hers." Heart heavy, Harriet reached for Edna's hand. "I'm so sorry." She swallowed a lump in her throat. "I'd like to read more from the diaries to see if they reveal anything that might give closure." "Would you be willing to help me piece together old memories?" Edna agreed. Over the next hour, Harriet shared some of the diary's key passages, and Edna offered commentary. The caretaker at the retirement community popped in with tea now and then, listening curiously herself, enthralled by the mystery. By the time Harriet headed home, she felt closer than ever to understanding the heartbreak that consumed the Cartwright estate. Back at home, Harriet retrieved the 1955 and 1956 diaries from the trunk. She settled at her kitchen table, determined to press on. The 1955 diary started with more heartbreak. Lydia's parents, in constant arguments, threatened to split. There were rumors that Mr. Cartwright wanted to sell the estate if expansions didn't pay off. Harriet felt Lydia's dread in every sentence, the child caught in the crossfire of an uncertain future. Then she found it, a final clue in the 1956 diary, which Lydia began writing on New Year's Day, January 1, 1956. Dolan is consumed by caution about fires. He says the house is old and prone to accidents. But I've never felt safe around him. He prowls at night with a lantern, checking rooms, or so he says. Father remains stressed. Mother is ill. I wish we could pack and leave, but Father says we must stay until the expansions are done. Harriet turned the page. March 3, 1956. I overheard Father telling Dolan he was behind on his insurance payments. Dolan said something like, "We can help you, just name your price." It sounded like blackmail. Father threw a glass against the wall. The next day I couldn't find Dolan, and no one would give me a straight answer. And then the final entry, heartbreakingly terse. April 12, 1956. The nights are restless. Father and Mother fight constantly. I smell kerosene again on the 3rd floor. I told Mother, but she insisted I don't rile Father. She's been coughing from the stress. I'm afraid something terrible is going to happen. My heart races at every corner. If only Charles were here. He was always kinder. Dolan's presence gives me the chills. I can't shake the feeling that tonight or tomorrow might bring a tragedy. I hope I'm wrong. This might be the last night I spend in this house. The page ended there, a swirl of black ink trailing off as if Lydia had pressed the pen too hard. Harriet stared at the page, overcome with a hollow sadness. This was likely the last diary entry Lydia wrote. The mansion burned on April 13, 1956. If she had any suspicion it would happen that soon, she hadn't left soon enough. Harriet placed the diaries on her kitchen table, letting the weight of Lydia's words sink in. She took out the faded newspaper clipping from the trunk, scanning the old article. Tragic fire strikes Cartwright Mansion. It reported the official fire marshal's statement. Cause unknown. House was undergoing expansions which may have compromised wiring. Rumors of foul play remain unconfirmed. Harriet searched the text, her eyes lingering on the final mention of a caretaker named Dolan, who had claimed he was not on the property at the time of the fire. Harriet suspected otherwise. She had to know, had he really left, or was Charles to blame, or possibly Mr. Cartwright himself? The diaries suggested that only Lydia was truly worried about the possibility of an intentional blaze. The next morning, Harriet walked to the lot where the old Cartwright mansion once stood. The property remained abandoned, a tangle of overgrown ivy and debris. The foundation's skeleton rose in a battered outline, reminiscent of the grand columns from the photograph. It felt eerie. The place had borne witness to heartbreak, secrets, and tragedy. Harriet thought about Lydia's final penned words, that sense of dread. She walked carefully through tall grass and snapped branches underfoot. The morning sun cast a pale light on the leftover shards of stone. She found a large chunk of blackened brick near where the front entrance might have been, rubbed it between her fingertips, flaking char onto the ground. She closed her eyes, imagining carriages rolling up to a grand entryway, Lydia waiting in a fine gown, a dream turned to ash. On a hunch, Harriet walked to the collapsed west wing. Roots twisted over piles of rubble, perhaps once a hallway. Something made her kneel. A small object. An old key dulled by time, peeked from beneath a rusted chunk of metal. Harriet pulled it free. She studied it closely. The shape was archaic, the handle bearing scrollwork. It was the size of a trunk or study key. She slipped it into her pocket, pulses of curiosity lighting in her mind. Had this key belonged to Mr. Cartwright's locked study, or something else? Back at the shop, Harriet installed the diaries in a place of honor behind the counter, carefully wrapped in archival tissue. She felt Lydia's story needed to be preserved. That day, she received a visit from a man named Aaron Cartwright, a distant descendant traveling after hearing that diaries from his family lineage had surfaced. He was middle-aged, with kind eyes searching the shelves until he found Harriet. "Miss Bell," he said softly. "I'm Aaron. I heard from Gloria at the library that you found some diaries of my great-aunt Lydia. I came to see them." "My family has always had questions about the fire." Harriet regarded him with gentle sympathy. "Yes, I have them. They are in fragile condition, but I'd be happy to show them to you." She paused. In them, Lydia expresses fear of a potential fire. She noted suspicious odors of kerosene. She believed caretaker Dullan might have had some hold over your great-grandfather. Harriet nodded, taking a seat at the battered wooden table in the corner, Harriet gently depositing the diaries in front of him. "My grandfather was just a boy back then, the younger brother. He wasn't home the night of the fire. He was away at boarding school. He never spoke much of the tragedy." With cautious reverence, Aaron opened the diaries, flipping through the pages Harriet had read so attentively. As he scanned Lydia's neat handwriting, Harriet retrieved the old key she'd found. "I discovered this among the mansion ruins just yesterday," she said, placing it on the table. "I don't know what it opens, but maybe it belonged to Mr. Cartwright." Aaron lifted it, turning it over in his palm. "My grandfather once mentioned that his father locked away some important documents in a chest or desk that may have proven that the expansions were fraudulent, or that the estate was running out of funds, something that would have threatened the Cartwright status. If that evidence got out, it would have been a scandal. You don't think that might have played a part in the fire, do you?" Harriet set her jaw thoughtfully. "Based on Lydia's diaries, I suspect your great-grandfather was in some kind of a deal with Dolan that went sour. Perhaps the fire was staged to collect on insurance before they lost everything." Aaron's gaze was heavy. "But it cost Lydia her life. How horrifying." They dipped into silence, Harriet's mind buzzing with possibilities. Then, resolute, she touched Aaron's arm. "I feel like Lydia wanted someone to know the truth, that she wasn't crazy to suspect that caretaker's involvement. We may never know exactly who lit the spark, but her diaries indicate plenty of friction that could have led to tragedy." Aaron closed the diary, a tear shining in his eye. "At least her voice lives on in these pages. I can sense her fear, her heartbreak. There's some measure of closure in that." Harriet nodded. "Maybe that's enough to honor Lydia's memory so the truth doesn't remain hidden." Over the next week, Harriet and Aaron collaborated. They carefully preserved the diaries, scanning them into digital copies for the local library so folks could learn about what truly happened at the Cartwright mansion. The diaries wouldn't solve the mystery perfectly. There were still unanswered questions regarding the caretaker's motives, the father's desperation, or whether Charles was framed and left out of fear. Nonetheless, it painted a more complete picture, showing that Lydia had seen the threat coming, and that there was definitely more going on than just a faulty wire. Word spread quickly around Poppywood about the diaries at Cozy Corner Thrift. Neighbors popped in to rummage for bargains and lingered to discuss the Cartwright tragedy, unraveling the old rumors in light of Lydia's first-hand account. The environment was more reflective than gossip-driven. Everyone felt an undercurrent of respect for the bright young woman who had faced her family's downfall with quiet courage. Families who had once traded in whispers for suspicion were now united in a calmer sense of compassion for how easily tragedy could strike. One quiet evening, Harriet found herself once more by lamplight at the trunk, the diaries neatly stacked inside, just as she had received them. She had decided the diaries would remain on display, with Aaron's blessing, in a glass case at Poppywood's modest local museum. It felt right, giving the past its own sacred space beyond the dusty corners of Cozy Corner Thrift. In her mind, Harriet could see Lydia stepping out of those diaries, Grateful that someone had finally heard her story, outside the shop dusk settled. The sidewalks emptied and Harriet flipped the door sign to closed. She locked the door and stood quietly, letting the hum of the overhead light envelop her in warm stillness. Then, gathering the diaries to place them in a new archival box for safe transport, she paused at the final volume 1956. She reread that last entry, feeling those words resonate. If only Charles were here. He was always kinder. I can't shake the feeling that tonight or tomorrow might bring a tragedy. I hope I'm wrong. Words from another era, cracked with heartbreak. Harriet inhaled a shaky breath, gently shut the leather cover, and placed it carefully with the others. Lydia had been right about the tragedy, but Harriet held on to the hope that, by rescuing her voice, perhaps something was finally made right. When she flicked off the lights, Harriet felt the intangible presence of the diaries lingering in the air, like the hush of a story concluding at last. Outside, a gentle spring breeze rustled the blossoms on the trees lining the sidewalks, as if beckoning Poppywood into a new season of revelation. And with that, Harriet stepped out of Cozy Corner Thrift, carrying Lydia's diaries, determined that Poppywood's forgotten thrifted past would remain forgotten no longer,